her fingers clenched over the emptiness of her womb, the same agony burning like molten metal for years. In a society where bearing children defined her worth, she was branded as defective. During the ritual under the moonlight, as silver rays began to rise from her skin, she would discover that some women were born to give life in extraordinary ways. Serena's fingers trembled as she pressed them against the cold stone wall of the healer's chamber, the cruel words still echoing in her mind, like poison seeping through her very soul. Barren, worthless, a burden to our sacred bloodline. The whispered accusations from the morning's gathering circle had cut deeper than any blade could ever reach. In the dim candlelight of the underground chamber where she worked as a healer's assistant, Serena felt the familiar weight of shame crushing her chest, making each breath a struggle against the suffocating reality of her existence. 23 years of life, and still she carried the mark of incompleteness that branded her as less than worthy in the eyes of her mountain-dwelling community. The scent of burning sage and dried moonflower petals filled the air around her, herbs that were supposed to cleanse and purify, yet they could not cleanse the stain of her barrenness. Above her head, intricate symbols carved into the stone ceiling seemed to mock her with their promises of fertility and abundance, blessings that would never be hers to claim. Each morning ritual, each full moon ceremony, each seasonal celebration only served to remind her of what she lacked, what she could never give to the ancient traditions that governed their isolated realm. Serena's reflection stared back at her from the polished metal surface of a ceremonial bowl, revealing features that others called beautiful, but she saw as cursed. Her dark hair fell in waves past her shoulders. Her green eyes held depths of wisdom earned through suffering, and her pale skin bore the subtle marks of countless hours spent grinding healing herbs under moonlight. Yet none of these gifts mattered when measured against the one thing she could never possess. The sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the stone corridors, and Serena quickly wiped away the tears that had begun to fall. Elder Morwen, the head healer, appeared in the doorway with her usual expression of stern disapproval. The old woman's silver hair was braided with sacred beads that clicked softly as she moved, and her weathered hands bore the stains of decades spent mixing potions and tending to the sick. The morning's work will not complete itself while you indulge in self-pity, child, Morwen said, her voice carrying the harsh edge that Serena had grown accustomed to over the years. There are wounded from last night's patrol, and the fever that struck the southern village shows no signs of breaking. Serena straightened her spine and nodded, pushing down the fresh wave of hurt that threatened to overwhelm her. She had learned long ago that showing weakness only invited more cruelty, more reminders of her inadequacy. With practiced movements, she began preparing the healing supplies, her hands steady despite the turmoil in her heart. As she worked, grinding dried bloodroot and mixing it with purified water drawn from the sacred spring, Serena allowed her mind to wander to the ancient stories that had always brought her comfort. Tales of the first mothers who had established their mountain sanctuary generations ago, women of power who had carved their civilization from the harsh wilderness through strength of will and magic that flowed through their bloodlines like rivers of liquid starlight. "Focus, girl," Morwen snapped, noticing Serena's momentary distraction. "Your daydreaming serves no one. Perhaps if you applied yourself with the dedication of a true daughter of our people, you might yet find some small purpose in this life the fates have given you." The casual cruelty of the words struck Serena like a physical blow, but she forced herself to remain silent. Speaking out would only bring more punishment, more reminders that she was tolerated rather than welcomed in this sacred space. She had learned to swallow her pain and channel it into her work, becoming skilled at reading the subtle signs of illness and injury that others often missed. The first patient of the day was brought in by two warriors whose faces bore the grim expressions of men who had seen too much death. The injured man was barely conscious, his breathing shallow and labored, deep claw marks across his chest, speaking of an encounter with one of the shadow beasts that roamed the deepest parts of their mountain territory. Serena's trained eye immediately assessed the wounds, noting the telltale blackness around the edges that indicated poison from the creature's claws. Without waiting for Morwen's direction, she began preparing the rare antidote, her movements swift and sure despite the gravity of the situation. "How did you know?" one of the warriors asked, watching as Serena mixed ingredients with an expertise that belied her low status. "Even our best healers sometimes miss the signs of shadow poison until it's too late." Before Serena could answer, Morwen stepped forward with a dismissive wave. "The girl has some small talent for reading sickness," the elder said coldly. "It is perhaps the only gift the gods saw fit to grant her, since they denied her the greater blessing of motherhood." The warrior's expression softened with something that might have been sympathy, but Serena pretended not to notice. She had no use for pity, especially from those who would never truly understand the depths of her isolation. Instead, she focused on applying the antidote to the man's wounds, watching as the blackness began to recede and his breathing grew steadier. The morning passed in a blur of patience and preparations, each case presenting its own challenges and requiring Serena's full attention. She treated a child's fever with cooling herbs, set a broken bone with splints carved from sacred wood, and prepared poultices for infected wounds. With each success, she felt a small spark of satisfaction, a reminder that despite her perceived worthlessness, she could still contribute something meaningful to her community. It was near midday when the summons came, delivered by a young apprentice whose eyes were wide with fear and excitement. The boy's voice cracked as he spoke, his words tumbling over each other in his haste to deliver his message. "All women of breeding age are called to the Great Assembly," he announced, his gaze flickering nervously between Serena and Elder Morwen. "Alpha Darius has returned from his pilgrimage and wishes to address the entire community about matters of great importance." Serena's blood turned to ice in her veins at the mention of their leader's name. Alpha Darius was a figure of such power and authority that even speaking his name felt like invoking forces beyond mortal comprehension. He ruled their mountain realm with a combination of wisdom, strength, and supernatural abilities that marked him as chosen by the ancient spirits themselves. "You need not concern yourself with such matters, child," Morwen said quickly, her tone unusually gentle. "The summons is for women who might contribute to our future, not for those whose path lies in service rather than creation." But the apprentice shook his head, consulting a scroll covered in official seals. "The summons specifically states all women of breeding age, with no exceptions. Alpha Darius was very clear that every member of our community must be present." The words hung in the air like a death sentence, and Serena felt the familiar burn of humiliation rising in her cheeks. To be forced to stand among the fertile women of her people, knowing that she was there only to fulfill a technicality, was a torture beyond description. Yet she had no choice but to obey, for defying an alpha's direct command was unthinkable. As she prepared to leave the healing chamber, Serena caught sight of her reflection once more in the polished metal bowl. The face that stared back at her was pale with dread, green eyes haunted by years of rejection and disappointment. She had attended gatherings before, always standing at the back, always hoping to remain invisible, while more worthy women stepped forward to receive attention and praise. The walk to the Great Assembly Hall felt like a march toward her own execution. Other women joined the procession as they climbed the winding stone steps that led to the heart of their mountain stronghold, their voices filled with excitement and speculation about what their alpha might announce. Some spoke of prophecies and ancient signs, others whispered about the possibility of a choosing ceremony that would elevate one of them to the highest position in their society. Serena listened to their chatter with a heart that grew heavier with each step. She recognized many of the voices, women who had been her childhood companions before the cruel realities of their society had driven them apart. There was Evangeline, whose golden hair and perfect features had made her the subject of admiring songs. There was Rosanna, whose mother's noble bloodline traced back to the original founders of their realm. And there was Celeste, whose fertility had been proven through successful pregnancies that had strengthened their community's future. Each of these women had something to offer, some quality that made them valuable in the eyes of their people. Serena had nothing but her healing skills and a barren womb that marked her as fundamentally flawed. The Great Assembly Hall was a marvel of ancient architecture, its soaring stone arches and intricate carvings speaking of a time when their people had commanded powers that were now only remembered in legends. Massive torches lined the walls, their flames casting dancing shadows across the gathered crowd, while the scent of burning cedar and sacred oils filled the air with an almost intoxicating richness. Serena found a place at the very back of the hall, hoping to blend into the shadows, where her presence might be forgotten. Around her, hundreds of women whispered among themselves, their voices creating a low hum of anticipation that seemed to vibrate through the very stones beneath their feet. Then he appeared, and the entire hall fell silent, as if struck by lightning. Alpha Darius stood at the front of the great chamber like a force of nature given human form, his presence so commanding that it seemed to pull the very air from the room. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair that caught the torchlight and eyes that burned with an inner fire that spoke of powers beyond mortal understanding. His face was carved with the sharp angles of nobility, and his bearing carried the absolute authority of one who had never known defeat. When he spoke, his voice carried to every corner of the vast hall without effort, each word resonating with a power that made Serena's pulse quicken despite her fear. "My daughters of the mountain realm," he began, his gaze sweeping across the assembled crowd with an intensity that made each woman feel as though he spoke directly to her heart. "I have returned from the sacred peaks where the ancient spirits dwell, and I bring news that will change the course of our destiny." A murmur of excitement rippled through the crowd, but Darius raised his hand and silence fell immediately. Serena found herself holding her breath, caught up in the magnetic pull of his presence, despite knowing that his words would not be meant for someone like her. "For too long, we have bound ourselves to traditions that no longer serve the needs of our changing world," he continued, his words striking the assembled women like thunder. "We have valued one gift above all others, forgetting that strength comes in many forms and wisdom can bloom in unexpected places." Serena's heart began to race as she tried to understand what he was saying. Around her, she could see confusion and concern on the faces of other women, particularly those who had always considered themselves the most likely candidates for positions of honor and responsibility. "The spirits have shown me visions of our future," Darius said, his voice growing stronger with each word. "They have revealed that the next Luna, the woman who will stand beside me as we lead our people into a new age, will not be chosen for her fertility alone. She will be chosen for her wisdom, her courage, her ability to see beyond the limitations that others accept as unchangeable truth." The words hit Serena like a physical force, leaving her gasping for breath as their implications slowly sank in. For the first time in her life, she dared to imagine that perhaps there might be a place for her in the bright future that their Alpha envisioned. But even as hope began to kindle in her heart, she could see the anger and disbelief on the faces of those around her. Women who had built their entire identities around their reproductive capabilities were now being told that such gifts might not be enough. The carefully maintained social order that had governed their lives for generations was being challenged in ways that would have consequences far beyond anything they could imagine. Darius's eyes swept across the crowd once more, and for one impossible moment, Serena thought his gaze lingered on her face in the shadows at the back of the hall. The contact lasted only seconds, but it was enough to send fire racing through her veins and plant a seed of possibility in the barren ground of her hopes. "The choosing will begin with the next full moon," he announced, his words sealing the fate of every woman in the hall. "Prepare yourselves, for the tests ahead will reveal who among you possesses the true strength to lead our people forward." As the Alpha's words echoed through the great hall, Serena felt the earth shifting beneath her feet. Everything she had believed about her place in the world was crumbling, replaced by possibilities she had never dared to dream. But she also sensed the dangerous undercurrents flowing through the crowd around her, the anger and desperation of those who saw their certainties dissolving into chaos. The gathering ended with traditional blessings and the sound of ceremonial drums that seemed to beat in rhythm with Serena's pounding heart. As the women began to file out of the hall, she caught fragments of heated conversations and whispered accusations that spoke of the storm that was already beginning to brew. "This is madness," she heard Evangeline say to her followers, her perfect features twisted with indignation. "How can he dismiss the sacred traditions that have guided our people for centuries?" "There must be some mistake," Rosanna added, her noble bearing rigid with shock. "Surely he cannot mean to ignore bloodlines and breeding potential entirely." But Serena barely heard their protests, for her mind was reeling with the magnitude of what had just occurred. For the first time in her life, she had been offered hope, a chance to prove that her worth extended beyond the curse of her barren womb. The path ahead would be treacherous, filled with challenges that would test every aspect of her strength and character. But it was a path that finally led somewhere other than a life of quiet desperation in the shadows. As she made her way back through the winding corridors toward the healing chamber, Serena caught sight of her reflection once more in a window's polished surface. The face that looked back at her was transformed, green eyes bright with newfound determination and cheeks flushed with the first warmth of genuine hope she had felt in years. But even as she embraced this unexpected gift, she could not shake the feeling that forces were already gathering against her, that the very announcement that had set her free had also painted a target on her back that would make her enemies of those who had once merely ignored her existence. The days ahead would test her in ways she could not yet imagine. But for the first time in her life, Serena felt ready to face whatever trials awaited her. She had been given a chance to prove that the barren daughter of the mountain realm could bloom into something magnificent, and she would not let fear or doubt steal that opportunity away. The sun was setting behind the mountain peaks as Serena returned to her small chamber, casting long shadows across the stone floors that seemed to whisper promises of changes yet to come. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to prove herself worthy of the impossible dream that had suddenly become possible. But tonight, she would allow herself to hope, to imagine a future where her healing gifts and hard-won wisdom might be valued above the capacity for childbirth that had always been denied to her. The transformation had begun, and there was no turning back from the destiny that beckoned her forward into an uncertain but finally hopeful future. The next 3 days passed like a fever dream, with whispers following Serena wherever she walked and eyes tracking her movements with newfound scrutiny that made her skin crawl with discomfort. The healing chamber that had once been her sanctuary now felt like a stage where every gesture was analyzed for signs of ambition she had never dared to possess. Elder Morwen's attitude had shifted dramatically since the Alpha's announcement, her previous cold indifference replaced by something far more dangerous, barely contained rage mixed with calculating speculation. The old woman watched Serena work with the intensity of a hawk studying its prey, waiting for any sign of weakness or presumption that could be exploited. "Do not allow foolish dreams to cloud your judgment, girl," Morwen said as they prepared morning remedies together, her voice dripping with venom. Whatever games the Alpha chooses to play, you must remember your place in the natural order of things. Some boundaries cannot be crossed, no matter what pretty words are spoken from positions of power. Serena kept her eyes focused on the herbs she was grinding, refusing to give the elder the satisfaction of a reaction. But inside, her heart burned with a mixture of defiance and terror that threatened to consume her entirely. She had spent so many years accepting limitations that the possibility of transcending them felt both exhilarating and absolutely terrifying. The sound of approaching footsteps interrupted her thoughts, and Serena looked up to see a figure she recognized but had never spoken to directly. Lucian, the Alpha's most trusted advisor, stood in the doorway with an expression of careful neutrality that revealed nothing of his true intentions. He was a man of perhaps 30 years, with sharp features and silver-streaked dark hair that spoke of wisdom earned through trials. His clothes were fine but practical, marking him as someone who valued substance over appearance, and his eyes held the kind of intelligence that missed very little of what occurred around him. "Serena of the Healing Arts," he said formally, his voice carrying the authority of one who spoke for the Alpha himself. "You are requested to present yourself at the private chambers this evening for consultation regarding your potential participation in the trials ahead." The words hit the chamber like a thunderbolt, and Serena felt her knees nearly buckle under the weight of their implications. A private audience with Alpha Darius was an honor that even the most noble-born women rarely received, and the fact that she was being summoned suggested possibilities that made her pulse race with equal parts hope and terror. Elder Morwen's face had gone pale with shock, her weathered hands trembling as she set down the pestle she had been using. "Surely there has been some mistake," she said quickly, her voice higher than usual. "This girl is merely an assistant, hardly worthy of the Alpha's personal attention." Lucian's gaze shifted to the elder with a coolness that made the temperature in the room seem to drop several degrees. "I carry the Alpha's direct commands, not suggestions open to interpretation or debate. Serena will present herself at sunset, prepared to discuss her qualifications and intentions regarding the trials." With that pronouncement, he turned and left, his footsteps echoing down the corridor with finality that left no room for argument or delay. Serena stood frozen in place, her mind reeling with the magnitude of what had just occurred, while Morwen stared at her with undisguised hatred. "You scheming little witch," the elder hissed once they were alone again. "What manipulations have you performed to capture his attention? What dark arts have you practiced in secret to make yourself appear worthy of consideration?" The accusations stung because they echoed Serena's own fears about her sudden change in circumstances. She had done nothing to attract the Alpha's notice beyond existing in her usual quiet obscurity, yet somehow she had become the focus of attention that felt both undeserved and desperately desired. "I have done nothing but my work as always," Serena replied quietly, her voice steady despite the chaos in her heart. "Whatever interest the Alpha may have in speaking with me comes from sources I do not understand." Morwen's eyes narrowed with suspicion and malice. "Mark my words, girl. This path you think you see before you leads only to destruction. You are not built for the kind of power that position requires, and attempting to grasp it will crush you like a flower beneath a boulder." The hours that followed passed with agonizing slowness as Serena tried to focus on her duties, while her mind raced with anticipation and dread. Every patient she treated seemed to stare at her with new curiosity. Every conversation around her seemed to carry hidden meanings and subtle threats. As sunset approached, she made her way to the bathing chambers to prepare for the most important meeting of her life. The warm water, scented with sacred oils, did little to calm her racing pulse. And as she dressed in her finest clothes, a simple but elegant gown of deep blue that brought out the green in her eyes, she caught sight of her reflection and barely recognized the woman staring back at her. There was something different in her face now, a spark of possibility that had never been there before, but also a vulnerability that made her appear younger and more fragile than her 23 years. She had spent so long hiding from attention that the prospect of being truly seen by someone as powerful as Alpha Darius felt like standing naked in a storm. The walk to the Alpha's private chambers led through parts of the mountain stronghold that Serena had never seen before. Corridors lined with ancient tapestries depicting the heroic deeds of their ancestors, and walls carved with protective symbols that seemed to pulse with their own inner light. Guards stood at intervals along the way, their faces respectfully neutral, but their eyes following her progress with obvious curiosity. When she finally reached the ornate doors that led to the Alpha's personal domain, Serena paused to gather her courage. Beyond those barriers waited a conversation that could change the entire course of her existence, and she was terrified of saying something that would reveal her unworthiness for the opportunity being offered. The doors opened at her approach, revealing a chamber that took her breath away with its unexpected beauty. Instead of the stark functionality she had expected, the room was warm and inviting, with comfortable furniture arranged around a fireplace that cast dancing shadows on walls, lined with books and ancient artifacts. The scent of sandalwood and pine filled the air, creating an atmosphere that was both regal and surprisingly intimate. Alpha Darius stood with his back to her, gazing out a window that offered a breathtaking view of the mountain peaks, bathed in the golden light of the setting sun. He had changed from his formal ceremonial robes into simpler clothes that somehow made him appear even more imposing, the casual elegance speaking of confidence that required no external displays of power. "Serena," he said without turning around, her name spoken in his deep voice, sending shivers down her spine. "Thank you for accepting my invitation. Please, make yourself comfortable." She moved carefully into the room, acutely aware of every sound her footsteps made on the polished stone floor. When he finally turned to face her, the full impact of his presence hit her like a physical force, and she had to remind herself to breathe normally. Up close, his features were even more striking than she had realized during the assembly. His dark eyes held depths that seemed to see straight through to her soul, and there was something in his expression that was both predatory and protective, as if he could be either her salvation or her destruction depending on choices that had yet to be made. "You seem nervous," he observed, his tone gentle but carrying an undercurrent of authority that made it impossible to dissemble or hide behind false confidence. "That is understandable, given the circumstances, but I hope you will speak freely. Honesty serves us both better than diplomatic prettiness." Serena found her voice, though it emerged softer than she intended. "I confess I am uncertain why you would wish to speak with me privately, Alpha. My qualifications for the trials you mentioned are questionable at best." A smile played at the corners of his mouth, transforming his austere features into something warmer and more approachable. "Your qualifications are exactly what I wish to discuss. Tell me, what do you know of your own gifts beyond the healing arts you practice?" The question caught her off guard, and she struggled to understand what he meant. "I know that I have some skill with reading illness and preparing remedies, but surely such abilities are common among those who work in the healing chambers." "Are they?" he asked, moving closer until she could feel the warmth radiating from his powerful frame. "When you treated the warrior with shadow poison 3 days ago, how did you recognize the symptoms so quickly?" Elder Morwyn herself admitted later that she had not immediately identified the threat. Serena felt heat rising in her cheeks as she realized he had been watching her work, observing her in ways she had never suspected. "I simply saw the signs that others missed. The discoloration, the particular way his breathing labored, the scent of corruption around the wounds. You saw what others could not see," Darius corrected, his eyes intense with interest. "You sensed things that training alone cannot teach. That is a gift, Serena, one that suggests abilities far beyond what you have been allowed to explore. His words stirred something deep within her, a recognition that perhaps the intuition she had always taken for granted was indeed something more significant than she had realized. But even as hope began to bloom in her chest, practical concerns reasserted themselves. Even if that were true, she said carefully, it does not change the fundamental issue of my condition. The traditions of our people are clear about what qualities are required in a Luna. Darius moved to pour wine from an elegant decanter, offering her a goblet with a gesture that brooked no refusal. The traditions were established in different times, for different needs. The world is changing, Serena, and we must change with it or face extinction. He settled into a chair near the fireplace, his movements graceful despite his imposing size, and gestured for her to take the seat across from him. The arrangement was intimate without being improper, creating a space where conversation could flow more naturally. During my pilgrimage to the sacred peaks, he continued, his voice taking on the cadence of someone sharing profound revelations, I experienced visions that showed me possible futures for our people. In every timeline where we prospered and grew strong, the changes began with abandoning rigid adherence to traditions that no longer served our survival. Serena sipped her wine, the rich flavor warming her from within and helping to ease some of her nervous tension. What did the visions show you about leadership, about the qualities that would be needed in challenging times? Wisdom, he said immediately, his gaze never leaving her face. The ability to see beyond surface appearances to the truth beneath. Courage to make difficult decisions even when they are unpopular. Compassion for those who suffer and the skill to heal divisions that threaten our unity. Each word he spoke seemed to resonate with something deep inside her, qualities she had developed through years of hardship and isolation, but had never considered valuable in terms of leadership. The possibility that her experiences as an outsider might actually prepare her for guiding others was revolutionary in ways that made her pulse quicken with excitement. But what of the other women? She asked, thinking of the confusion and anger she had witnessed in the Great Hall. Many have prepared their entire lives for the possibility of being chosen as Luna. They have bloodlines and proven fertility that surely outweigh any small gifts I might possess. Darius leaned forward slightly, his intensity making the space between them feel charged with electricity. Bloodlines are important, but they guarantee nothing about character or ability. Fertility is valuable, but not at the expense of every other quality that makes a leader effective. The spirits showed me that our survival depends on choosing based on wisdom rather than tradition. The conversation continued deep into the evening, ranging across topics that Serena had never expected to discuss with anyone, let alone the most powerful man in their realm. They spoke of healing practices and ancient knowledge, of the challenges facing their people and the changes needed to ensure their continued prosperity. As the hours passed, she found herself relaxing in his presence, her natural intelligence and hard-won insights emerging as they explored ideas that had long been confined to her private thoughts. Darius listened with genuine interest, asking questions that demonstrated he valued her opinions and wanted to understand her perspective on complex issues. There is something else we must discuss, he said, as the fire began to burn low in the grate. The trials I announced will not be easy, and you should understand what participating will cost you. The serious tone of his voice brought Serena's attention sharply into focus. What kind of trials are you planning? Tests that will reveal the true nature of each candidate, he replied, his expression growing grave. Physical challenges to demonstrate courage and endurance, intellectual puzzles to show wisdom and creativity, and spiritual trials to prove connection with the forces that guide our people. But beyond the formal tests, you must be prepared for opposition from those who see you as a threat to their own ambitions. Serena felt a chill of fear at his words, remembering the anger she had witnessed in the Great Hall and the hostility she had already begun to encounter. You believe there will be active resistance to my participation? I believe there are those who will do whatever they feel necessary to preserve what they see as the natural order, Darius said carefully. Your success would represent changes that some find deeply threatening to their sense of identity and place in our society. The implications of his warning settled over her like a heavy cloak, and she understood that accepting this opportunity would mean stepping into a world of politics and intrigue, for which her sheltered life had provided no preparation. Yet even as fear whispered warnings in her mind, determination began to crystallize in her heart. If I choose to participate, she said slowly, testing the words as she spoke them, what support can I expect? What resources will be available to help me survive the trials ahead? Darius smiled, and there was something in his expression that spoke of approval and perhaps even admiration. You will have access to training in areas where your background has left gaps in your knowledge. Combat instruction, diplomatic protocol, the political complexities of leadership. But ultimately, success or failure will depend on qualities you already possess. As the evening drew to a close, Serena found herself standing at a crossroads that would define the rest of her existence. She could return to the safety of her healing chamber and the familiar pain of her limited life, or she could step forward into uncertainty and the possibility of transformation that terrified and exhilarated her in equal measure. I need time to consider everything you have told me, she said finally, her voice steady despite the turmoil in her heart. Of course, Darius replied, rising from his chair with fluid grace. But do not take too long. The trials begin with the next full moon, and preparation requires time that grows shorter with each passing day. As he walked her to the door, his presence seemed to envelop her in warmth and strength that made her feel simultaneously protected and exposed. When he placed his hand gently on her shoulder in farewell, the contact sent electricity racing through her entire body, awakening sensations she had never experienced before. Whatever you decide, he said softly, his voice carrying undertones that made her pulse race. Know that I see potential in you that others have overlooked. The question is whether you are brave enough to see it in yourself. The walk back to her chambers passed in a blur of racing thoughts and warring emotions. The conversation had opened doors in her mind that she had never known existed, revealing possibilities that both thrilled and terrified her beyond description. But as she prepared for bed, Serena could not shake the feeling that forces were already moving against her, that the very opportunity she was considering would make her enemies of people who had the power to destroy her utterly. The path forward was fraught with dangers she could barely comprehend, yet it was the only path that offered hope of becoming something more than the broken, barren woman she had always believed herself to be. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and fresh opportunities to prove her worth, but tonight she would allow herself to imagine a future where her gifts were valued and her voice carried weight in decisions that shaped their world. The transformation she had feared was impossible had already begun, and there was no returning to the safety of her former invisibility. The choice before her was simple in concept, but devastating in its implications. Remain in the shadows and accept the limitations that others had imposed upon her, or step into the light and fight for a destiny that seemed impossibly beyond her reach, but beckoned with irresistible power. The decision crystallized in Serena's mind before dawn broke over the mountain peaks, arriving with the clarity of inevitability that left no room for doubt or retreat. She would enter the trials, not because she believed she could win, but because the alternative meant accepting defeat before the battle had even begun. The announcement of her participation sent shockwaves through their mountain community that reverberated in ways both subtle and dramatic. Whispered conversations ceased abruptly when she passed, replaced by stares that burned with curiosity, contempt, or something far more dangerous than either. The careful social order that had governed their lives for generations was fracturing, and Serena found herself at the center of a storm that threatened to tear apart everything their people held sacred. Evangeline was the first to confront her directly, cornering Serena in the herb garden, where she gathered supplies for the healing chambers. The golden-haired beauty moved with predatory grace, her perfect features twisted by rage and disbelief that transformed her ethereal loveliness into something cold and menacing. "You pathetic, desperate creature," Evangeline hissed, her voice dripping with venom that made the morning air feel poisonous. "Do you truly believe that playing on the Alpha's momentary madness will elevate you above your natural station? You are barren, worthless, a genetic dead end that threatens the very survival of our bloodline." Serena continued picking herbs with steady hands, refusing to give her tormentor the satisfaction of a visible reaction. "I have made no claims about my worthiness," she replied quietly. "I have simply accepted an opportunity to prove myself through the same trials that will test us all." "Test us all?" Evangeline laughed, the sound sharp and bitter as broken glass. "You delude yourself if you think this is about fairness or equal opportunity. This is about power, influence, and the future of our people. Things that someone like you could never understand, let alone manage successfully." The cruel words struck deep, echoing doubts that Serena had been fighting since her conversation with Alpha Darius. But even as fear whispered in her mind, determination burned brighter, fueled by years of accepting limitations that others had imposed upon her without question or resistance. Before she could respond, another voice cut through the tension like a blade drawn from its sheath. Perhaps it would be wise to save such passion for the trials themselves, where it might actually serve some useful purpose. Both women turned to see Rosanna approaching, her noble bearing and rich clothing marking her as someone accustomed to deference and respect. Unlike Evangeline's open hostility, Rosanna's demeanor carried the cold politeness of someone who considered herself so far above her competition that direct confrontation was beneath her dignity. "Serena," she said with a smile that never reached her calculating eyes, "how interesting that you have chosen to participate. I confess I am curious to see how someone of your limited background will handle challenges that have been designed to test the finest qualities of our bloodline." The subtle insult was delivered with such elegant precision that it took a moment for its full impact to register. Rosanna had managed to question Serena's competence, bloodline, and right to participate while maintaining the appearance of polite interest, a skill that spoke of years training in the deadly art of social warfare. "I suppose we will all discover our strengths and weaknesses together," Serena replied carefully, recognizing that she was facing opponents who wielded words as weapons with lethal effectiveness. "The trials will reveal what each of us truly possesses beneath our assumptions and pretensions." Evangeline's face flushed with anger at the implied criticism, but Rosanna merely raised an eyebrow with amused condescension. "Indeed they will," she agreed smoothly, "though I suspect some revelations will be more disappointing than others." The encounter left Serena shaken, but more resolved than ever to prove that their dismissive assumptions were built on foundations of prejudice rather than truth. She had spent her entire life accepting other people's judgments about her worth, but the trials offered a chance to let actions speak louder than the cruel whispers that had defined her existence. The formal preparation period began 3 days later, with all candidates gathering in the ancient training grounds, where their ancestors had honed the skills necessary for survival in their harsh mountain realm. Serena felt overwhelmed by the sight of women who moved with confident grace, their bodies shaped by years of privileged training that she had been denied. Master Kieran, the chief weapons instructor, surveyed the assembled candidates with the critical eye of someone who had trained warriors for more than 30 years. His scarred face and weathered hands spoke of battles fought and victories earned through skill and determination rather than birthright or favor. Combat training will focus on practical defense rather than elaborate techniques, he announced, his voice carrying across the training ground with military precision. Real threats do not wait for you to perform perfect forms or display elegant footwork. They attack with lethal intent, and your response must be equally decisive. Serena's heart sank as she watched the other women demonstrate abilities that clearly came from years of formal instruction. They wielded swords with fluid competence, their movements displaying muscle memory built through countless hours of practice that she had spent grinding herbs and tending wounds. But when her turn came to face the practice dummy, something unexpected happened. The years of precise knife work required for her healing arts translated into surprising effectiveness with a blade, her hands steady and sure, despite her lack of formal training. The desperate hunger to prove herself drove her to push beyond what she thought possible, and Master Kieran's approving nod sent warmth flooding through her chest. "Interesting technique," he commented after watching her complete the exercise. "Unorthodox, but practical. We will build on what you already possess, rather than trying to remake you into something you are not." The diplomatic training proved even more challenging than combat instruction, revealing gaps in her knowledge that felt like chasms impossible to cross. Protocol, negotiation, the subtle languages of power and influence, all areas where her sheltered life had left her woefully unprepared for the realities of leadership. Ambassador Helena, an elegant woman whose silver hair and sharp eyes spoke of decades navigating political complexities, watched Serena struggle with barely concealed skepticism. "Leadership requires the ability to read subtext and hidden meanings," she explained during a particularly difficult lesson. "A Luna must understand not just what is said, but what is left unspoken, what is implied through gesture and tone." But even as Serena stumbled through exercises in diplomatic language and courtly etiquette, she began to recognize that her years of reading illness and injury had developed observational skills that translated surprisingly well to reading people. The subtle signs of deception, the tells that revealed true emotion beneath carefully composed facades, these were abilities she had been developing without realizing their broader applications. The weeks of preparation flew by with exhausting intensity, each day bringing new challenges that tested her limits and revealed capabilities she had never suspected. Physical training pushed her body beyond what she thought possible. Intellectual exercises stretched her mind in directions it had never explored, and spiritual practices opened connections to forces that had always remained tantalizingly beyond her reach. Through it all, she was acutely aware of being watched and judged by rivals who had not abandoned their hostility, but had simply learned to express it more subtly. Sabotage became a constant concern, with equipment mysteriously malfunctioning and training schedules suddenly changing without notice. The psychological pressure was relentless, designed to break her confidence and force her to withdraw from competition. But perhaps the most unexpected development was the gradual shift in how some members of their community began to view her participation. Elder Thane, whose vast knowledge of ancient lore made him one of their most respected advisors, sought her out after a particularly challenging lesson in traditional histories. "Your questions show a mind that seeks understanding rather than merely memorizing facts," he said, his weathered face creased with something that might have been approval. That kind of intellectual curiosity has been rare among recent candidates, who seem more concerned with avoiding mistakes than discovering new possibilities. His words planted seeds of confidence that began to grow despite the hostile environment surrounding her. Perhaps her different background and unconventional perspective might be assets rather than liabilities in the challenges ahead. The night before the trials officially began, Serena stood alone on her chamber's balcony, gazing up at the full moon that would witness her transformation one way or another. The silver light seemed to pulse with energy that resonated in her bones, awakening sensations she had never experienced but somehow recognized as part of her deepest nature. A soft knock at her door interrupted her contemplation, and she opened it to find Alpha Darius standing in the corridor. His presence filled the small space with warmth and power that made her pulse quicken with reactions she was only beginning to understand. "Tomorrow changes everything," he said simply, stepping into her chamber with an intimacy that should have felt improper, but instead seemed perfectly natural. "Are you prepared for what comes next?" "I am as ready as I can be," she replied, acutely aware of how his nearness affected her breathing and made her skin tingle with electricity. "Though I suspect the trials will reveal preparations I did not know I needed to make." He moved to stand beside her on the balcony, his shoulder brushing against hers in a contact that sent fire racing through her veins. "There is something I must tell you before the trials begin," he said, his voice carrying undertones that made her heart race with anticipation and dread. "What is it?" she asked, turning to face him fully and finding herself trapped by the intensity in his dark eyes. "Your infertility," he said gently, the words hitting her like physical blows, despite his careful tone. "It may not be the permanent condition you believe it to be." The world seemed to tilt on its axis, and Serena had to grip the balcony railing to keep from swaying. "What do you mean?" "During my research into your background, I discovered records suggesting that your condition results from a curse placed on your bloodline generations ago," Darius explained, his words carefully measured to soften their devastating impact. "A curse that can be broken under specific circumstances." Hope and terror warred in her chest as the implications of his revelation slowly sank in. "What circumstances?" "True love, freely given and received," he said simply, his gaze never leaving her face, "combined with trials that test the worthiness of both partners to break the bonds that bind them." The silence that followed his words stretched between them like a chasm filled with possibilities too overwhelming to fully comprehend. Everything she had believed about herself and her limitations was crumbling, replaced by prospects that seemed too miraculous to be real. "Why are you telling me this now?" she whispered, her voice barely audible above the mountain wind. "Because the trials ahead will test more than your individual abilities," Darius replied, stepping closer until she could feel the warmth radiating from his powerful frame. "They will test the connection between us, the bond that has been growing stronger since our first conversation." Before she could respond, he cupped her face gently in his hands, his touch sending shockwaves through her entire being. "Serena," he said softly, her name a prayer on his lips. "Whatever happens in the trials, know that you have already proven yourself worthy in ways that matter more than any test could measure." The kiss that followed was tender, yet passionate, a claiming that spoke of desires too long suppressed and connections that transcended the boundaries of tradition and expectation. In that moment, Serena felt something fundamental shift in her understanding of herself and her place in the world. When they finally broke apart, both breathing heavily, she saw something in his eyes that took her breath away completely. Love, honest and unguarded, offered without reservation or condition. For the first time in her life, she was not just wanted, but truly cherished by someone who saw her worth clearly. "The trials begin at dawn," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "But whatever challenges we face, we will face them together." The first trial came with the rising sun, gathering all candidates in the ancient amphitheater where their ancestors had once made decisions that shaped the destiny of their people. The stone seats were filled with community members who had come to witness history in the making, their faces revealing the full spectrum of emotions from excitement to disapproval. Elder Thane stood at the center of the arena, his voice carrying clearly to every corner of the ancient structure. "The first challenge tests courage and quick thinking under pressure," he announced. Each candidate will face a scenario that simulates real leadership crises, with success measured not by perfect solutions, but by sound judgment and decisive action. Serena watched as the other women took their turns, each facing elaborate scenarios that tested different aspects of their leadership potential. Evangeline handled a diplomatic crisis with confident authority that drew approving nods from the watching crowd. Rosanna demonstrated strategic thinking while managing resource shortages with elegant efficiency. When Serena's turn arrived, she found herself facing a scenario that seemed designed specifically to exploit her perceived weaknesses. A plague outbreak that threatened to devastate their community while political enemies used the crisis to undermine leadership authority. But as she began to address the simulation, drawing upon her extensive knowledge of healing arts and her hard-won understanding of human nature, something remarkable happened. The very experiences that had made her an outsider provided insights that others missed, perspectives that led to solutions nobody else had considered. She identified the plague's source through symptoms that others had overlooked, proposed treatment protocols that addressed both immediate needs and long-term prevention, and managed political opposition with a combination of firm authority and genuine compassion that drew surprised murmurs of approval from the watching crowd. When the trial concluded, even Elder Thane seemed impressed by her performance. Unconventional methods, he announced, but remarkably effective results. The second trial tested physical courage and combat readiness, taking place in the treacherous mountain passes where real dangers lurked in shadow and stone. Each candidate faced actual shadow beasts under controlled conditions, with success measured by survival and protection of assigned civilians. Serena's heart pounded as she entered the designated area, her newly acquired combat skills feeling inadequate against creatures that had haunted her nightmares since childhood. But when the attack came, instinct and desperation combined to produce fighting techniques that compensated for her lack of formal training. More importantly, her healer's instincts drove her to prioritize protecting the civilians assigned to her care above personal glory or impressive displays of combat prowess. While other candidates focused on defeating their opponents with maximum efficiency, Serena concentrated on ensuring that everyone under her protection survived the encounter intact. The approach earned her criticism from some observers who expected more aggressive tactics, but Alpha Darius's approving nod made her feel that she had chosen correctly despite the controversy her methods generated. The final trial was the most challenging of all, a spiritual test that required candidates to commune directly with the ancient forces that governed their mountain realm and receive wisdom or guidance that would benefit their entire community. In the sacred grove, where their ancestors had once received visions that shaped their civilization, Serena knelt before the altar of the First Mothers and opened her mind to influences she had never dared to invite. The experience that followed defied description, visions and sensations that seemed to reshape her understanding of reality itself. She saw the truth of the curse that had bound her bloodline, understood the forces that had shaped her life, and received knowledge about healing practices that had been lost for generations. But most importantly, she experienced a profound connection to the spiritual foundations of their community that revealed her true purpose and destiny. When she emerged from the trance-like state, her eyes glowed with inner light that made even the most skeptical observers gasp with recognition. She had been touched by powers that chose their vessels carefully, marked as someone worthy of the deepest secrets their ancestors had guarded. The announcement of the results came as the sun set behind the mountain peaks, Alpha Darius standing before the assembled community with an expression that revealed nothing of his inner thoughts. The trials have revealed qualities in all candidates that honor our traditions and strengthen our future, he began, his voice carrying to every corner of the great amphitheater. but one among you has demonstrated the combination of wisdom, courage, and spiritual connection that our people need in the challenging times ahead. The new Luna, chosen by trial and touched by the ancient spirits themselves, is Serena of the healing arts. The announcement sent shockwaves through the crowd, reactions ranging from surprised approval to outraged disbelief. But before opposition could organize itself into coherent protest, something extraordinary happened that silenced every voice in the amphitheater. Serena felt power flowing through her body like liquid fire, the curse that had bound her bloodline finally breaking under the weight of true love freely given and received. The barrenness that had defined her existence melted away, replaced by the fierce certainty that she would bear children who would lead their people into a new age of prosperity and strength. As Alpha Darius took her hand and lifted it high in triumph, their joined hands seemed to glow within a light that spoke of destinies intertwined and futures transformed beyond recognition. The broken, rejected woman who had entered the trials had emerged as something magnificent, a Luna whose unconventional path to power would inspire generations to come. "The goddess has spoken," Elder Thane announced, his voice filled with awe and reverence. "The age of change has begun, and we are blessed to witness its birth." In the celebrations that followed, as their community embraced the transformation that Serena's victory represented, she found herself thinking about the journey that had brought her to this impossible moment. The pain and rejection that had once seemed like curses had actually been preparation for a destiny beyond her wildest dreams. As she stood beside Darius, accepting congratulations from people who had once dismissed her as worthless, Serena understood that true strength came not from meeting others' expectations, but from transcending limitations that others tried to impose. She had been rejected by conventional standards only to be crowned by love that saw her true worth clearly. The future stretched before them, bright with promise. Challenges that would test their united strength and wisdom, but also opportunities to build something better than what had come before. The barren daughter of the mountain realm had bloomed into a Luna whose reign would be remembered long after the stars themselves had forgotten their ancient patterns. And in the quiet moments between public celebrations, when she and Darius stole precious time alone together, Serena marveled at the transformation that love had wrought in her understanding of herself and her place in their world. She was no longer defined by what she lacked, but celebrated for what she possessed. A heart strong enough to heal divisions, wisdom deep enough to guide her people through change, and love powerful enough to break curses that had lasted for generations. The broken had become whole, the rejected had been chosen, and the impossible had become inevitable through the alchemy of true love and unshakable determination. Her story would inspire others who felt powerless to discover the strength that had always resided within them, waiting for the right moment to emerge and change the world forever.